He stood at every meeting, smiled through every lie, and fined us into silence. But when I walked in with proof, he knew it was over. What happens when the president of your community becomes the enemy? Simple. You fight backhand, you bring receipts. Let me start by saying I never wanted to get involved in community politics. I like to keep to myself, mow my lawn, pay my dues, and wave politely to neighbors. That was until our homeowners association president, Craig Bennett, turned a quiet neighborhood into a tightly controlled, fear-driven mess of secrets and fines. But I didn't realize how deep it all went until I heard what he was hiding. Once I uncovered the truth, I knew I had to crash the next board meeting with the proof in my hands. It started small. A fine for leaving my trash can out past 9 a.m. on collection day. Then, a warning letter for having excessively bright solar lights in my front yard. Petty things. I laughed them off. But then my neighbor, Mrs. Linton, 82-year-old widow, was slapped with a $600 fine for feeding birds in her own backyard. That's when I knew something was wrong. Don't take it personally, she whispered to me one day while we chatted by her fence. Craig's on a mission, but not the kind he tells people. When I asked her what she meant, she just shook her head. You'll find out. They always do too late. The they she referred to. I'd learned soon enough that it was a long list of people Craig had quietly steamrolled, people who had questioned him, voted against him, or simply stood in his way. They vanished from the neighborhood or sold their homes in frustration one by one. At the time, I chalked it up to HOA politics gone bad. Every community has a few power-hungry folks. I figured Craig was just another one of them, but then something happened that made me look deeper. It was a Tuesday morning when I saw two unfamiliar men walking around the perimeter of my property. One of them had a clipboard. The other was taking photos of my backyard through the fence. I stepped outside and demanded to know who they were. Routine inspection. The one with the clipboard said flatly, HOA compliance. They didn't wear badges, no uniforms, no notice. Just two strangers, walking around like they owned the place. I filed a complaint with the HOA the next day. A week later, I received a letter, not an apology, but a warning. According to the letter, my property was under review for multiple potential violations, including grass length, unauthorized landscaping, and non-conforming paint color. Except I hadn't painted anything. I asked for documentation. None was provided. I requested a hearing. It was denied, and that's when I got angry. Craig Bennett had been president of the HOA for nearly 6 years. Re-elected unopposed every time. No one else dared run against him. He kept the board stacked with people who owed him favors or feared his wrath. He controlled the fines, the rules, and the enforcement with almost no oversight. I decided to dig. At first, I just looked into the HOA bylaws. They were riddled with vague language and ambiguous enforcement clauses. Craig had used them to weaponize minor rules against residents, but I still didn't have proof of any real wrongdoing until I found a paper trail. It started with a hunch. I searched through public county records and discovered something interesting. Over the last 3 years, at least 8 properties in our neighborhood had gone into voluntary, early foreclosure. That wouldn't normally raise eyebrows, but every single one of those properties had racked up fines from the HOA within months of being listed. And guess who had quietly purchased 3 of them? That's right, Craig Bennett. But he didn't buy them in his name. He used an LLC, a local property management company called Clearpine Ventures, a company that, when I dug deeper, was registered to his cousin, with Craig listed as a consultant. Now I had something. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering everything I could. Screenshots, public documents, county filings, board meeting minutes, tax filings. The pattern was clear. Craig used his authority to harass and fine certain homeowners until they gave up and sold cheap. Then Clearpine Ventures would buy the homes, flip them, or rent them out. It was disgusting and illegal. Still, I needed more. Fines alone weren't criminal unless Craig profited from their enforcement. So I set a trap. I called Clearpine Ventures, pretending to be a buyer looking to purchase a house in our neighborhood. The woman on the phone was polite until I mentioned I was in the HOA. She stiffened. We don't usually disclose our seller affiliations with the board, she said, but if you know Craig, then we can definitely talk. Bingo. I recorded the entire call. Then I contacted a former board member who had moved away last year. Under suspicious circumstances, she was hesitant at first, but after I told her what I'd found, she agreed to meet. We sat at a diner on the edge of town. She told me Craig had been pushing to buy up problem homes for years, and had even rewritten internal HOA procedures to give himself more control over the fines process. When she objected, she was iced out, harassed, and eventually voted off. Watch out, she warned. He'll come for you next. But I wasn't scared. I was livid. So I got to work. I printed out everything: emails, call logs, recorded transcripts, purchase records, legal filings, even side-by-side comparisons of enforcement actions that targeted specific people. I bound it all together in a folder labeled HOA Corruption Report, and I marked my calendar for the next board meeting. Craig didn't know it yet, but his reign was about to end. The night of the meeting, I didn't walk, I marched. I wore a plain button-up shirt, slacks, and carried a black folder under my arm. My phone was in my jacket pocket, recording. I had rehearsed every word, every fact, every document reference, because tonight wasn't just about calling Craig Bennett out, it was about showing the entire neighborhood exactly who he was. The HOA meetings were usually sleepy affairs, held in the rec center at 7 p.m. with barely 10 people in attendance. But word must have spread. When I arrived, there were over 40 chairs filled, with more people standing in the back. Craig was already seated at the head of the table, smug as ever in his blazer with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Next to him sat the rest of his hand-picked board. For members who rarely spoke unless prompted. "Looks like we have a bigger crowd than usual," Craig said, flashing his politician's smile. "Let's keep this quick and orderly." The meeting kicked off with the usual scripted agenda: budget approvals, landscaping contracts, and a quick review of recent fines and enforcements. Craig sped through it like always, not bothering to open the floor. That's when I stood up. "Excuse me," I said clearly. "I have a matter that affects the entire community, and I think everyone here deserves to hear it." Craig looked annoyed, but tried to hide it. "Sir, this isn't the time for open." "Actually," I interrupted. "Per the HOA's own bylaw section for paragraph B, you're required to allow member concerns to be voiced at any official meeting." "Shall I quote it?" "A few people," murmured someone near the front, actually pulled out a copy of the bylaws. Craig clenched his jaw. "Fine, you have 2 minutes." "I'll take 5, I said, walking up to the front. I placed my folder on the table and opened it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My name is Daniel Hartman. I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years. And for the past 3 months, I've been investigating how the HOA is being used not to protect this community, but to profit off of it, specifically by its president, Craig Bennett. A wave of stunned silence swept across the room. Craig laughed dryly. "This is ridiculous." "I thought so too, at first," I said, flipping the first page. "But then I looked into Clearpine Ventures, LLC, a property investment company quietly buying up foreclosed homes in our neighborhood, and guess who's listed as a paid consultant? Craig Bennett." Now the room wasn't silent. It was buzzing. Craig's face had gone pale, then red. "This is slander," he barked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do." I held up the call transcript. I posed as a potential buyer. The woman I spoke with said, and I quote, "If you know Craig, we can definitely talk. I have the call recorded, want to hear it." He didn't answer. I also spoke with a former board member someone Craig had forced out after she questioned his ethics. She confirmed that Craig rewrote several enforcement procedures to gain more control over the fine and foreclosure process. A woman in the audience gasped. I recognized her. She'd gotten a fine last month for parking line violations. I kept going. I pulled county foreclosure records. 8 properties were fined repeatedly, foreclosed early, and purchased by Clearpine at a discount. Craig used his authority to financially squeeze homeowners, then bought their properties through a shell company. "Enough," Craig shouted, standing up. "No," I said, "not until the neighborhood hears everything." I passed copies of the report to the board members and placed several on the side table for residents. One board member, Karen Fields, skimmed the top page, her brows furrowed. She whispered to the others, who looked visibly shaken. These weren't rumors. These were facts with evidence. Someone in the crowd stood up. "My brother's house was one of those 8. He moved out after Craig fined him into bankruptcy." Another voice, "How many of these rules are real? Or just made up by you?" Craig tried to talk over everyone, but the room had turned. The neighbors weren't just angry, they were betrayed. I raised my voice just enough. "Craig Bennett has used his position to manipulate, harass, and financially ruin members of this community for personal gain. I am officially calling for a vote of no confidence, and the immediate suspension of Craig Bennett pending legal review." Craig laughed nervously. "That's not how this works." But Karen Fields stood up. "Actually, it is." And I seconded the motion. Then a third board member, Don, spoke. "We were never told about Clearpine. If this is true, it's a serious breach of ethics." "It's more than ethics," I said, "it's criminal." A board vote was called on the spot. Craig protested, argued, yelled until 2 security officers stepped inside from the hallway, summoned by a concerned resident. He finally sat, breathing heavily. The board voted 4-1. Craig was suspended pending investigation. He stormed out of the building, his face red, phone pressed to his ear, barking into the speaker. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat down. Around me, people whispered. Some clapped softly. Others looked at me with awe, gratitude, or something else, respect. But it wasn't over yet. I had taken him down from the inside. Now it was time to take him down legally. After that explosive meeting, the neighborhood buzzed like a kicked beehive. The board officially suspended Craig Bennett pending review, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. not for what he did. So, I filed a formal complaint with the county ethics commission and forwarded every document, every recording, every statement to the district attorney's office. Within 2 weeks, an investigator reached out to me. They took it seriously. The DA's office launched a full-blown investigation into Craig and his ties to Clearpine Ventures. Several residents who had lost their homes were contacted to provide testimony. More board members came forward, finally willing to admit what they had seen, and what they'd been too afraid to challenge. Then came the search warrant. The county sheriff's department raided Craig's home office, seizing laptops, external hard drives, and boxes of HOA records. It made the local news. And suddenly, everyone in town had something to say. Residents who had never attended a single meeting were now showing up with questions. Others began to demand audits of every major expense Craig had approved over the past 3 years, including the suspicious $27,000 pavement assessment that never seemed to result in any actual repairs. Craig, meanwhile, went silent, deactivated his social media accounts, stopped showing up in public. Word was, his cousin, the one who fronted Clearpine Ventures, fled the state. But this story didn't end with his fall. No, the real work came after. The HOA board held a special election, and to my surprise, they nominated me to run for interim president. I declined. I had no interest in power, just in protecting the people from those who abuse it. Instead, I supported Karen Fields, the board member who'd stood up first during the meeting. She was honest, experienced, and unafraid. Under her leadership, things started changing fast. First, the board voted to eliminate the most punitive fine structures Craig had installed. Then, they restructured the enforcement process so no single board member could trigger an inspection or violation. Everything had to be voted on, publicly documented, and accessible to all members. The bylaws were re-reviewed and rewritten in plain English, with full community input. And the fear that once hung over our neighborhood, gone. People started putting up porch swings again. Bird feeders reappeared in backyards. Even Mrs. Linton started baking cookies for the kids next door, smiling like she'd just gotten her house back, which, in many ways, she had. As for Craig, 6 months later, he was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of public funds. Investigators discovered he had embezzled nearly $190,000 through shell companies and false repair invoices. During the trial, his lawyer tried to argue it was all misunderstandings and sloppy bookkeeping. But the jury didn't buy it. Guilty. Guilty. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to affected homeowners. Some got money back. Others got closure. I got something else, a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, just a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat block letters. You did what no one else dared to. Thank you for all of us. No name, no signature, but it didn't matter. That single sentence made every late night of research, every risk, every meeting I forced myself to sit through, worth it, because it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, and truth is a powerful thing, especially when people in power think they're untouchable. But wait, there's one last part of this story. Months later, a new couple moved into one of the homes Craig had tried to flip. They found an old box buried in the attic, covered in dust. It was filled with files, printed emails, handwritten notes, and voice memos on a digital recorder. Turns out, Craig had been planning something even worse. A full rewrite of the HOA charter to give himself indefinite control. Under the guise of emergency continuity, the drafts were dated just weeks before I exposed him. He hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been working toward total control. We submitted the files to the DA's office, who added obstruction of justice and attempted fraud to his record. The new HOA board now keeps those documents in a sealed archive labeled, "The Warning That Saved Us." And me, I still mow my lawn. I still wave to my neighbors. But every now and then, I see someone walking through the neighborhood who wasn't here when Craig ruled it. They ask why we have such open board meetings, why we post every budget online, why the community actually feels like a community. And I just smile and say, because once, the president lied, and we all learned the truth the hard way. But now, we don't let anyone step on our rights again.